was a Tuesday morning in April, the kind of morning where the air still smells like coffee and normalcy. Families were waking up. Children were walking to school. Somewhere in Ohio, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret was reaching under her bed for the small tin box she had kept for 11 years. Inside that box was everything she had left after the crash. Not paper. Paper had already betrayed her. Inside that box was gold. 17 coins, polished, real, untouchable by any bank, any panic, any collapse. She believed that. She had staked her survival on that belief. By nightfall on April 5th, 1933, owning those coins was a federal crime. Not a rumor, not a threat, a crime, punishable by a $10,000 fine and 10 years in federal prison. Overnight, the savings that Margaret had hidden from the banking system, the savings she thought were beyond reach, had been declared contraband by the President of the United States, and almost nobody saw it coming. That is the part that should chill you. Not that it happened, but that it happened quietly, legally, and with the full machinery of the state operating in plain sight. This is the story of Executive Order 6102, the day the American government reached into the private savings of its own citizens, stripped them of their most durable asset, and handed that wealth upward to an institution that had helped engineer the very crisis it was now being asked to solve. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history. This is the legal architecture of state-level theft, and it has a template that has been reused, a template that is gathering dust in very important offices right now. Let us go back further, not to April, to the decade before. To understand what 6102 was, you have to understand what preceded it. Because confiscation does not arrive as a monster. It arrives as a solution. The 1,920 seconds had been a decade of extraordinary credit expansion. We covered this in a previous investigation. The Federal Reserve, under Benjamin Strong, had flooded the system with cheap money. Installment credit had turned ordinary Americans into leveraged consumers. A car you could not afford on Tuesday was yours by Friday, with a signature and a smile. Stocks were purchased on margin. Real estate was purchased on speculation. The entire architecture of American prosperity was built not on savings, but on debt that was dressed up to look like wealth. When the crash came in 1929, it did not come gently. It came like a demolition. Between September 1929 and July 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 89% of its value. 89%. That is not a correction. That is annihilation. 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933. 9,000 institutions that held the deposits of ordinary Americans simply stopped existing. People who had done everything right, who had not speculated, who had not borrowed recklessly, walked to their bank one morning and found a locked door and a paper notice and nothing else. And so they did what frightened people have always done. They reached for the one thing they believed no paper decree could dissolve. They reached for gold. Between 1931 and 1933, Americans began withdrawing gold from the banking system at an accelerating rate. This was their legal right. Under the gold standard, every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold held in reserve. Citizens were legally entitled to exchange their paper currency for physical gold at any Federal Reserve Bank, and they were doing it. By early 1933, the Federal Reserve was hemorrhaging gold reserves at a rate that threatened the entire monetary system, not because the public was doing anything illegal, Because the public had correctly identified that the paper promises of institutions were no longer trustworthy. This is the moment worth pausing on. Ask yourself this. When the entire banking system collapses, when 9,000 institutions vanish, when unemployment hits 25% and breadlines stretch around city blocks, who is actually to blame? The citizens who trusted the system, or the architects of the system who built it on an unstable foundation of leveraged credit and captured monetary policy? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the answer to that question determines everything that happens next in this story. What happened next was Franklin Delano Roosevelt signing Executive Order 6102 on April 5th, 1933, 11 weeks into his presidency. The order invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime measure originally designed to prevent American citizens from financially supporting hostile foreign powers. Roosevelt's administration adapted this legislation for domestic use, directing it not at foreign enemies, but at American citizens who were exercising their lawful right to hold gold. The legal mechanism was breathtaking in its audacity. By declaring a national banking emergency, the administration granted itself extraordinary executive power that in normal times would have required an act of Congress, power that was never fully revoked. The order required all persons within the continental United States to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank, a branch or agency thereof, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System. Deliver. That word was doing an enormous amount of work. Deliver. Not sell, not exchange through a voluntary market transaction. Deliver, as in surrender, as in compliance is not optional, as in the alternative is federal prosecution. The compensation offered was $20.67 per troy ounce. That was the official price. The government set it. The government enforced it. You had no negotiating position. You had no market to appeal to. You had a date, a location, and a federal penalty waiting if you failed to appear. Now here is where the machinery of legalized theft reveals its full geometry. Once the confiscation was complete, once the gold was transferred from private hands into Federal Reserve vaults, the government changed the price. In January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act reset the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase overnight. The citizens who had been forced to surrender their gold at the old price watched the government immediately revalue that same gold at a dramatically higher price. The wealth differential, the gap between what was paid and what the gold was then worth, flowed directly to the United States Treasury and by extension to the Federal Reserve System. This was not a historical accident. This was a structured transfer. The sequence, confiscation at artificially suppressed prices followed by immediate revaluation at higher prices, is the mechanical definition of wealth extraction. The public bore the loss. The institutional architecture absorbed the gain. Let us now examine the three phases of this operation with precision. Phase 1 was the emergency declaration. Roosevelt signed Executive Proclamation 2039 on March 6th, declaring a national bank holiday and closing every bank in the country for 4 days. This served multiple functions. It prevented further gold withdrawals, buying time for the legal framework of 6,102 to be constructed. It created an atmosphere of crisis management that made extraordinary executive action feel necessary rather than predatory. And it established the precedent that in a declared emergency, normal property rights could be suspended by executive fiat. The Trading with the Enemy Act, passed 16 years earlier to fight a world war, became the legal skeleton for a domestic asset seizure operation. No new legislation was required. The existing wartime emergency powers framework was simply retrofitted and redeployed. That retrofitting required fewer than 11 weeks from inauguration to execution. Phase 2 was the confiscation and compliance architecture. The order exempted certain categories: jewelry and art objects, gold used in industrial or professional applications, a small holding of up to $100 per person for unusual circumstances. These exemptions were not acts of generosity. They were engineering decisions. By exempting decorative and industrial gold while targeting monetary gold specifically, the order created a clear distinction between gold as wealth storage and gold as ornament. The government was not interested in your wedding ring. It was interested in your savings architecture. The exemptions also served to fragment potential resistance. If certain populations were exempted, the confiscation appeared selective and reasonable rather than universal and authoritarian. Meanwhile, the penalties for non-compliance were set high enough to achieve near total voluntary submission without the government needing to conduct mass prosecutions. 10 years and $10,000 and $1,933 was existentially catastrophic. Very few people tested that boundary. Phase 3 was the revaluation and institutional transfer. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 accomplished several things simultaneously. It nationalized all gold held by Federal Reserve banks, transferring legal title to the United States Treasury. It raised the official gold price by 69%. It issued the Treasury gold certificates that replaced the gold previously held by the Federal Reserve, giving the Fed a paper asset backed by the now more valuable gold sitting in Treasury vaults. And it permanently prohibited private gold ownership for monetary purposes, a prohibition that would remain in effect for 41 years, until President Gerald Ford signed legislation in December 1974, allowing Americans to legally own gold again. 41 years, an entire generation of Americans lived and died under a legal regime in which owning the most durable monetary asset in human history was a federal crime. Think about what that means in terms of wealth accumulation. Every financial crisis during those 41 years, and there were several, was navigated by ordinary Americans without access to the asset class that has historically performed best during monetary instability. They were limited to paper instruments, bank deposits, and equities, all of which are subject to institutional failure, inflationary erosion, and regulatory control. The one asset that sits outside that system was forbidden to them by law. And who moved to safety before the confiscation? Let us examine that question with the precision it deserves. The Federal Reserve banks were informed of the policy direction before the public announcement. This is not speculation. It is documented in the congressional record of the hearings surrounding the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. The major banking institutions had advanced knowledge of the framework being constructed. They understood that gold would be confiscated at $20.67 and subsequently revalued. The question of whether institutional actors positioned accordingly in the days before the public announcement is one that the historical record has never fully resolved. What is documented is that the Federal Reserve System itself, as an institution, emerged from the confiscation dramatically strengthened. Its balance sheet expanded. Its reserve position was enhanced by the influx of confiscated gold delivered by civilians at artificially suppressed prices. The institution that had presided over a decade of inflationary credit expansion and the subsequent collapse was rewarded with the savings of the population that had survived that collapse. There is a word for a system in which private losses are absorbed by ordinary citizens, while institutional actors are protected and even enriched by the crisis management response. The word is not complicated. The word is captured. The regulatory framework that enabled 6,102 was not dismantled after the emergency passed. The Trading with the Enemy Act remained on the books. The emergency powers architecture remained available for future executive use. The precedent that a declared financial emergency could trigger asset confiscation with minimal congressional input was established and never overturned. In 1977, Congress passed the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which significantly clarified and in some ways expanded the president's emergency economic authority. The toolkit that was assembled in 1933 was not returned to storage. It was cataloged, refined, and kept ready. We are living in a monetary environment that shares structural characteristics with 1933 in ways that should require your complete attention. Global sovereign debt is at levels that have no historical precedent in peacetime. The United States national debt crossed $35 trillion in 2024. Interest payments on that debt now exceed defense spending. Central banks globally have spent the better part of 2 decades suppressing interest rates to levels below real inflation, a policy that systematically transfers wealth from savers to debtors. Pension systems across the developed world are underfunded by amounts that dwarf the GDP of mid-sized economies. The retirement promises made to an aging population cannot be fulfilled with the assets currently held against them. Something is going to give. The only real question is who bears the loss when it does. And here the history of 6102 becomes not an antiquarian curiosity, but a strategic warning. Because the lesson of 1933 is not that governments are evil. The lesson is that governments under extreme fiscal pressure will reach for extraordinary tools. They will reach for those tools using legal frameworks that already exist. They will deploy them quickly. They will deploy them under emergency language that makes the deployment feel necessary rather than predatory. And by the time the public fully understands what has happened, the mechanism will have already completed its transfer. What survived 1933? Not paper currency. The dollar was immediately devalued by 69% relative to gold the moment the Gold Reserve Act passed. Not bank deposits. 9,000 banks had already demonstrated what bank deposits were worth when the institution holding them failed. What survived was physical gold held outside the banking system by the fraction of the population that did not comply or held in foreign jurisdictions beyond the reach of the executive order. What survived was real assets with intrinsic utility, land, agricultural capacity, tools of production. What survived was diversification across jurisdictions, the recognition that no single government's legal framework should encompass your entire asset architecture. We are not in 1933. The specific mechanism of gold confiscation as it was executed in 1933 faces practical obstacles in the current environment that did not exist then. Physical gold is globally distributed. Digital assets exist outside traditional banking infrastructure. Property rights in multiple jurisdictions are accessible to a far broader segment of the population than they were 90 years ago. But the principle of 6102, the principle that emergency conditions can be used to justify extraordinary government reach into private wealth, remains fully intact. The legal architecture is not rusted. It is maintained. The question you should be asking right now is not whether 6102 can happen again in exactly the form it took in 1933. The question is whether the underlying logic that produced 6102, the logic of state fiscal desperation, institutional protection, and civilian wealth absorption, can recombine in a new configuration that achieves the same outcome through different mechanisms. capital controls, bail-in legislation, which already exists in the regulatory frameworks of the United States and European Union, allowing bank deposits to be converted to equity in a failing institution, sovereign wealth seizure through taxation of unrealized gains, mandatory allocation of retirement assets to government bonds. None of these require an executive order signed at midnight. Some of them are already partially in place. The history of systemic fracture is the history of gradual normalization followed by sudden execution. The precedent is set quietly. The framework is legalized incrementally. And then, one Tuesday morning, the school teacher reaches under her bed and everything has changed. Share this video with one person you care about because this warning is too critical to keep hidden. Margaret's 17 coins were surrendered. The system that took them immediately made them worth 69% more, then kept the difference. The emergency that justified the taking was resolved. The emergency powers that enabled it were not. That is the structure. That is the template. That is what you are looking at when you look at any moment of fiscal crisis in any government carrying unsustainable debt obligations. The crisis is real. The solution will be framed as necessary, and the question of who bears the cost of that solution will be decided not in a public referendum, but in a signed document on a Tuesday morning before most people have finished their coffee. Know what has survived before. Hold what cannot be recalled. Diversify beyond the reach of any single legal jurisdiction and study the mechanisms, not the headlines. Headlines tell you what happened. Mechanisms tell you what is being prepared. If this investigation opened a door for you, subscribe to the Sovereign Archive. Every video in this channel is a chapter in a larger investigation into the systems that shape your financial reality, written not to alarm you, but to arm you. The archive is waiting. The next investigation is already prepared. The question is whether you will be ready when the next Tuesday morning arrives.